So hello everyone, welcome to the first TransAsiaSTS network seminar. My name is Gergely Mohácsi. I'm an anthropologist at Osaka University and I will moderate this seminar today from Osaka, right here where I am. So please allow me a few introductory remarks on this TransAsiaSTS network that as I mentioned, is the very first seminar that we have. This network was formed last year to promote scholarly exchange and collaborations in the field of science and technology studies across Asia, where both STS and Asia are very broadly conceived for us. We in this network aspire to connect existing STS institutions, societies, and fellow networks in South, East, and Southeast Asia, Australasia, and the Pacific, and draw in scholars and organizations working beyond these established STS infrastructures as well. We are supported by the infrastructures of the transnational STS network. Next, I will tell you a few words on the technicalities of today's seminar. As you know, because you are watching it, you are watching this seminar on YouTube. There's a chat box there. It is hosted today by Lily Fernley and Emma Koval. Please feel free to introduce yourself and use the chat to make any comments along the way. Over Twitter, Alok Kandekar will be live tweeting this seminar using hashtag TransAsiaSTS. Feel free to add your live tweets or comments. You can post any questions for our speaker using that hashtag, and Alok will pass them on to me here, and I will ask your comments or questions from the speaker, from Itty. Okay, so please especially post questions for our speaker in the chat, and Lyle and Emma will pass them on to me. You can post questions at any time during the talk or the question and answer time. We will have plenty of time. We'll have time until it's a 90 minutes event, so I will have plenty of time for you to question. So please keep questions then coming. So finally, before we start, let me introduce our speaker and discussant for today. Dr. Itty Abraham is a professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He earned his Ph.D. in political science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. There, he compared the Indian and Brazilian experience of the development of indigenous high technologies. His research interests recently include international relations, STS, science and technology studies, and postcolonial theory. Among the many and diverse scholarly works he published, and you can obviously find it all over the internet and on his page, I would especially recommend you the following two books, both published from Asia. One is a single-authored book titled The Making of the Indian Atomic Bomb, Science, Secrecy, and the Postcolonial State. And the other one is a co-authored one titled Political Violence in South and Southeast Asia, Critical Perspectives. It's been published by United Nations University Press in Tokyo. And probably he has a lot of other things to tell about himself. Maybe he can continue after he finishes his, starts his presentation. Our discussant today is Dr. Usha Raman. She's a professor of media studies at the University of Hyderabad. Most of her research focuses on science and health communication, digital cultures, feminist media studies, and narrative journalism. You may want to check out her articles published in Feminist Media Studies on public discourse around sexual violence in India, or some of her earlier work on clinician-patient communication in the Journal of Qualitative Health Research. So without further delay, I'll hand over to Itty to present his talk entitled Technology as a Political Instrument, the Tactical and the Strategic. Sounds like a very exciting title. So Itty, please start your. You are muted, Itty.
Somehow I never managed to get that right. Thank you, Gergely. Thank you, everybody, for this very kind invitation to present at the inaugural TransAsiaSTS seminar. I'm looking forward to hearing all the speeches that come, all the talks that come after mine. In particular, I want to thank Emma, Alok, Gergi for the very kind introduction. And of course, the discussant, who's somebody I haven't seen in a very long time, Usha Raman. Thanks, Usha, for being willing to take the time to do this. I also want to thank at the outset my collaborator in this particular study, a PhD student here at the National University of Singapore, Miriam Jan, who has worked on this project with me for a number of years and who's completing a PhD on the Rohingya, particularly Rohingya journeys to Thailand and Nepal. It's going to be a terrific PhD when it's done, so small shout out for her. I'm going to be speaking somewhat quickly because I have about 35 minutes, I'm told by the organizers, followed by the discussant. And I'll be happy to fill in any details that I didn't go into deeply enough in the normal presentation when we reach the Q&A section. And finally, let me just say that I want to try and include in this talk two kinds of issues. One to do with the Rohingya use of technology, the main focus of the talk, but also some reflections about STS in Asia, perhaps even going beyond Asia to include something we might call the global STS. So for those of you who want to pick up on those issues, I'd be very keen to hear your thoughts and ideas when we get to the discussion. I'm going to share my screen at this point to get us started. If somebody could let me know that it's working okay. Yes, Usha, I can see you putting your hand up. Okay. The first thing I should mention, which you will notice, is that the title that you've been given has been changed. My apologies to all of you, but I think this just reflects what I'm getting at a little more clearly. I'm always stuck when I'm asked for titles before the talk because the talks I'm giving are usually not complete at that time. So they get revised constantly until they're ready. So I'm changing the title to Technology and the Political, Confrontation and Recognition. And as you can see, it's based on an article that was already published in Nations and Nationalism. So for those of you who want more details, I refer you to that piece. Yeah. So let me begin by giving you an outline of where I'm going to go in this talk. I'm going to begin with the discussion of the use by Rohingya diasporic activists of various refugees to contest the brutal state actions of the Burmese or Myanmar government. I'm going to then sum up draw out some of the conclusions and contradictions that we can find from that presentation, and then turn finally to the idea of the politics of STS as a somewhat underdeveloped area, especially when we compare the contributions of sociologists and anthropologists and historians in particular to STS. It's particularly noticeable for me, at least, that political questions around these issues have been somewhat less elaborated. And it's not that they've been done badly, but I think there's much more that we need to be considering. And I'm going to raise some of those questions towards the end of my talk. So, as I said a moment ago, the politics of technoscience is perhaps the least developed, in my view, area of STS. In particular, because the tradition has always been to assume a liberal democracy, which is interested in questions of rights. I'm adjusting the screen just a little bit at my end. Yeah. Worries about the decline of democracy and privacy, loss of control, and seeks in very deliberate and conscious and useful ways to ameliorate that loss of control and the decline of democracy through a variety of different instruments, including participation, which is one of the constant themes in the STS literature. Now, I don't consider that to be in any way mistaken or wrong, but I just think it's not enough. And I think that what we can do in particular when we think about the Asian context is to see the varieties of political fields that open up when we consider the Asian world, which is less democratic than authoritarian. And I feel that that actually asks us to complicate our ideas a little bit more. So I'm trying to introduce, if you will, a larger canvas from which a political theory around questions of technoscience can be developed or can form. But before we get there, that's going to be the very end of the talk. I want to turn to the main case study of my discussion today, namely the issue of Rohingya in Myanmar or Burma, as some prefer to call it. Now, all of you listening to this talk, I think, know where the country is, but I always feel it's useful to start with a map to remind us of the part of the world we're looking at. Myanmar, of course, positioned between India, China in particular, and various Southeast Asian countries. On the right of this, the second image on the right, of course, is the map of the Rakhine state, where the Rohingya come from. There are also Rakhine-speaking people, and so sometimes that area is called Arakan. The Rakhine people have their own problems with the Burmese majority, but of course, the issue that's been in the news now for many, many years is about the vicious and violent expulsion of Rohingya from their homeland under the false claim that they are not Burmese, that they have been recent immigrants to the country, that they're Bangladeshis, and inherently, in a sense, don't belong within the state. There's a long political history here, which I'm not going to go into. Just know that their citizenship has been effectively removed ever since the first major military coup in 1962. It's just been getting worse and worse for them. Before that, of course, Rohingya were part of the mainstream of Myanmar, including serving in the parliament in 1948. Again, very, very, very broad and brief introduction to the idea of ethnicity in Myanmar. It's comprised a number of different ethnic groups, mostly based in the margins of the country. That raises for the military, of course, very sensitive questions because their location brings in the geopolitics of the region immediately. These are regions that all neighbor other countries, and so the involvement of another country like Bangladesh, India, China, Laos, Thailand is always a part of these of the politics, if you will, of ethnicity in Myanmar. And Thailand in particular knows this only too well because they are the country that suffered the most, you might say. Every time there's a crackdown in the country, as there is right now, people flee across the border to Thailand to the many, many, many refugee camps that are based there. I'm going to move on, again, assuming that you know most of this. It's really a very, very broad outline. To point to the different ways in which the Rohingya have used the sea in order to escape from their condition, seeking a better life. This is not by any way an accurate map. Just see it as sort of broadly indicative of the kinds of directions that Rohingya have fled in. One of the most common spots in which Rohingya boats end up in is Indonesia. After being in Indonesia for some time, they tend to prefer to go to Malaysia because it's easier for them to work there. And it's easier to, there's already a community there, and it's easier to send remittances back home. So the group of people that I'm going to be talking about today are in fact Rohingya who are living in Kuala Lumpur, who have managed to acquire some kind of citizenship or permanent residency. They constitute a diaspora. They tend to be young, they tend to be male, and they tend to be technologically quite sophisticated. So by no means am I suggesting that this is typical of the Myanmar diaspora, of the Rohingya diaspora in general. This is obviously a very privileged group, but it's still, I think, very important to see what they're doing and see what they're hoping to achieve from it to understand what the politics of both forced expulsion, forced migration, but also diasporic nationalism looks like in this day and age when mediated through technology, as we're going to see. The diaspora, just a quick word, spreads over quite a few countries. I would particularly draw your attention to the diaspora in Saudi Arabia, both because the numbers are quite large, larger than I think many of you might expect, but also because a lot of the funding for the work that the diasporic groups are doing comes from Saudis, Rohingyas in Saudi Arabia, who have managed to acquire some capital, some resources, and use some of that money in order to aid the larger process of helping the Rohingya diaspora all over the world. Now, I'm going to suggest that there are two kinds of political actions being taken by this group of young men based in KL, Kuala Lumpur, and they're divided into two categories, which I'm calling the politics of confrontation and the politics of recognition. So the politics of confrontation, I think, is a very familiar kind of politics that we're all familiar with. In a sense, it imagines primarily two antagonists, a powerful state, a repressive state, an oppressive form of government, and a popular movement or a social movement of some kind, which is trying to resist them in different ways. We've heard all too many cases in the last 20 years, I would say in particular, of the ways in which social movements have been transformed as a result of access to different social media technologies. Twitter, YouTube, Facebook have all become part of the repertoire of groups now seeking to contest or to confront authoritarian and oppressive states. And in that sense, Rohingyas are no different. I'm particularly interested in one form of their protest, one form of their resistance, which is known as Rohingya Vision TV, which is hosted on YouTube, and which follows the format of a national news program. So every day, there's clips uploaded to Rohingya Vision TV, which tell you about the state of the Rohingya, both in Myanmar, but also around in the diaspora as well. So you have to see this both as a form of contesting what the state is putting out as the actual state of affairs. They're saying, no, this is really the truth of the matter. At the same time, they're offering a link between the different diasporic groups, in a sense, stitching them together into an overseas body, an overseas national body, if you will. The nation part of the body, of course, is very much in formation, but think of it both think of it as providing two functions, a function of resistance and a function of joining, bringing together these groups from around the world. Now, as you can imagine, Rohingya TV is covering Rohingya issues is not easy. This particular TV station is notable for the fact that they use a lot of young men who are embedded within the communities that they cover. These are local journalists, citizen journalists, if you will, who have absolutely very, very little by way of technology in terms of how they cover the stories that they do. They have video cameras, they have phones, and they have solar equipment in order to charge their phones and so on. They, in a sense, operate in daylight. I mean, they're out there in the open. The local community often knows who they are. But of course, if they're caught by the government, it's going to be trouble for them. So they have to, at the same time, remain undercover to the extent possible. Sometimes there's 2 or 3 of them working in the same area. Sometimes they don't know who each other are, so that the news can be confirmed by more than one source in good journalistic practice. So I want to also point out one more thing on the screen in front of you. If you look at the picture of Aung San Suu Kyi on your screen, you will see some lettering, a script below that, below her speech. That is script in the Rohingya language. And I'm going to say more about that in a second. And I want you to compare it to another screenshot that I've got of another presentation that the Rohingya are doing. And here you will see Burmese script at the bottom of the screen below the lady in the hijab. And I want to point out the difference between those two and its significance in a moment. So this is what a Rohingya TV output looks like. I was lucky enough to visit their studio in KL and got a sense of how they put their stuff together. It's really a shoestring operation. I mean, they have some equipment, but this is not CNN, but they do the best that they can in order to do their job. And I think they do a really terrific job. Okay, this is part 1, the politics of confrontation, a very familiar kind of politics today, where one group, in a sense, seeing itself as marginalized and oppressed and receiving injustice, pushes back against a powerful state, using, in a sense, whatever tools at their disposal to contest, to disagree, to counter, to offer a different way of seeing the problem, which is very much from their standpoint. I want to shift now to a different kind of politics. Here's one more image. Their YouTube channel now has 257,000 subscribers. This is from a couple of months ago, I think. So it's probably even gone up a little bit more since this time. I just say this also because I want you to realize, this has quite a wide reach. Now I want to switch to a different kind of politics, which I'm calling the politics of recognition. And I'm going to offer 3 examples of what that means, and then draw out some of the contrasts between confrontation and recognition as different modes of politics in this particular moment. The first one I'm going to look at is the quote-unquote alternative World Cup organized by CONIFA, not FIFA, for all those countries that don't belong to FIFA. They have their own World Cup too. These are not necessarily countries. These are often, shall we say, entities, non-sovereign entities, places, and people. And I'll give you an example of what those are. Then I want to turn to the Unicode, to the Rohingya, these activists' discussion with Unicode for how the approval of the Rohingya script came about. And finally, I want to talk about an ongoing project that they're engaged in, which is the creation of a database of refugee identity using blockchain technology. Okay, the other World Cup, for some of you who may have heard of this, there have been 3 of them that have been held. The last one was held in London in 2018. There was supposed to be one in 2020, but it was cancelled because of the pandemic. And it was hosted by the Somali diaspora in England, which was making their first appearance in the competition. Other teams include Northern Cyprus, Padania, which is a region of northern Italy, Szekely land, a Hungarian linguistic minority based in Romania, Punjab, a joint Punjabi team from both India and Pakistan, but mostly composed of people living in the UK. Western Armenia, a refugee team, Kabylia, Abkhazia, Tibet, United Koreans, Tamil Elam, and on and on and on. So you can imagine this is a kind of a fabulous list of places and people who are in the news, usually for completely different reasons. And the organizers of this CONIFA World Cup are seeking very much, of course, to use football as a way of drawing attention to the particular issues being faced by these peoples. Now, a football competition doesn't change the world. But every time a government contests or gets angry or upset about the fact that a minority that they may not recognize as being oppressed is taking part in this, you just have to think about the Tibetans taking part in this and the likely reaction from the People's Republic of China. They actually draw attention to their cause. They actually make it appear, they remind people that there are these minorities living in these countries, living under conditions that they're not comfortable with or happy with. And in a sense, the more they protest, the more they draw attention to this issue. Now, for a lot of people just seeing this on television or going to attend one of these matches, this has the appearance of a normal football tournament. It normalizes the idea that these countries, quote unquote, these entities could be part of a landscape that doesn't exist right now. So you could imagine it as a kind of a political imaginary of the future being played out on the ground in the form of a football match. All right, this is the Rohingya Football Club website. They have applied to be in the next World Cup. Let's see if they get in. There's another Rohingya team based in Ireland, which also wants to represent the Rohingya, so they're going to have to work this one out. But the moment the Rohingya become part of this entity, they acquire legitimacy as an independent entity in a different kind of way. And it's really that different kind of way, which is bypassing the Myanmar state, which is what I'm getting at when I talk about the politics of recognition. An entirely different kind of issue comes up when we think about the question of Unicode and the digitizing of the Rohingya script through Unicode. Now, I think many of you know that if you want to have a script appear on screen, it's not something you can unilaterally decide that you want to do. So if you want to use the Roman script to English, the language, the script in which English is written, or if you want to use Devanagari for Hindi, there actually is a process by which permission is given and the necessary software is produced in order for these scripts to appear on screen and appear the same everywhere in the world. Now, this decision is made by something called the Unicode Consortium, a US-based and registered nonprofit private corporation that regulates the representation of text in all modern software standards, products and standards. In particular, there is a committee called the International Organization for Standardization Subcommittee for Unicode, which is the one that actually reviews and agrees to the requests by different people to put scripts on screen. And this is quite a laborious process. It's not just a question of putting in an application and then getting approved the next day, and then you can go ahead. In fact, it actually has to meet a number of very stringent requirements, most particularly that the language is still in use and that the number of users are adequate to justify the material and technical investments necessary to generate a script online. In particular, what the consortium is interested in, and the subcommittee of this consortium is interested in, is the type of user as well. If there are a lot of young school children who use the script, if it's being used in schools, if there are textbooks that are being written in this language, that's the kind of thing they want to see to make sure that it's actually going to be useful once they put it out there and make it available for everybody. So as you can imagine, for a diasporic community to produce this kind of text takes a lot of work and a lot of trouble, given how scattered they are and given the lack of standardization and uniformity in the conditions under which they're living. If you can imagine the huge refugee camps in Bangladesh, it's going to be so hard, as you might know, to actually just have those services reach the people in those camps, let alone producing textbooks for them, let alone making it possible for them to have classes online. But yet, that's necessary in order for them to acquire some degree of education, even as they're waiting and hoping either to return to their homelands or to be resettled in a third country. Now, the Rohingya language for a long time was an oral language. When there was a need for any script, it was most often the Burmese script, as we saw earlier in the Rohingya TV screenshot that I showed you, or Arabic. but both scripts in a sense are somewhat inadequate for capturing all the sounds and nuances of the language needed to represent the language textually. So in the early 1980s, a scribe, a scholar, Hanif, living in the diaspora in Saudi Arabia, helped to develop a language for this alphabet. An alphabet for this language. Now, obviously, at this point, there was a choice to be made, what to have the language actually look like. And as you can see, and I'm going to go back now to that earlier script, it's not, if this is the Burmese script you can see at the bottom of the screen here, this is the Rohingya script, which looks a lot more like Arabic than it does Burmese. And this was a very conscious choice, because what they wanted to do was to separate or to distance themselves from the Burmese who had been oppressing them for so long, and to mobilize the help of people in the Muslim diaspora and the Muslim world more generally, by reminding them that here was a Muslim minority which was being oppressed and which needed their help. So it's neither Burmese nor Bengali, which the Rohingya language sounds like, and much, much closer to Arabic in its form. Anyway, it took a long time, as you can imagine, for this process to get underway, for the Unicode consortium to agree that this was a reasonable script to digitize, but eventually they managed to get it done, and now it is available on screen as never before. Now, what we are also talking about at this point is, apart from the mechanics of getting the script approved, is the endorsement implicitly by Unicode, which is an international body composed both of countries as well as corporations. And here I will just remind you what those are. Some of the largest corporations in the world. And I think it's fair to say today that if Facebook supports you, it's probably more important than some smaller countries around the world, right? Because the kind of weight of Facebook's approval and the ability to see your script in that platform, in a sense, means much more than a vote in the United Nations, where you have the support of 1 or 2 or 3 countries that may not, unfortunately, play such a large role in the international system. So Unicode acceptance is not simply a question of saying, oh, there's a technical matter, let's get our script on screen. In effect, it also acts to legitimize the idea that there is a separate Rohingya people with a separate language, with a separate script, and it has been endorsed or in some ways supported by these very, very powerful companies and countries, including Microsoft, Adobe, Apple, Google, Huawei, and many, many others that you can see. In particular, one of the consultants to the Rohingya was a language lab at the University of California, Berkeley. And so you could argue, in a sense, that even they had, bought into the idea that there should be a separate script for these people. And here is an example of what the textbooks, school textbooks look like. So again, in a sense, we're talking about this community bypassing the state, the Burmese state, to create an identity for itself online, which is quite unique and distinct and doesn't appear to be political at first glance, but then you realize the implications of it are actually hugely political. This is the alphabet. It's known as Hanifi Rohingya, based on the author, the person who designed and invented it about 40 years ago now. Okay, now the last example I'm going to mention, again, excuse me for rushing through this so quickly, but I'm trying to get through a lot today, which is the use of blockchain to create a refugee database. Now, many of you will know that the refugee question in Asia is particularly complicated because most Asian countries, barring very, very few, Cambodia, East Timor, Philippines, have not signed the Refugee Convention. In other words, if you apply to be a refugee in those countries, you have no legal standing. You can go to the UNHCR office and register yourself as a refugee, but from the point of view of the government in whose country you're in, you are an irregular migrant. So this, of course, causes enormous problems for anyone seeking asylum, because until they've gotten approval from the UNHCR, the process of approval can take up to 6 or 7 years sometimes. And even then, there's no guarantee that you will be approved. You're essentially in legal limbo. You've left the country that you've come from, and it's for good reason. You do have no yet country to go to. The country that you're in doesn't recognize you as a refugee, but as an illegal migrant. And so obviously the most obvious and basic conditions of your life are completely very, very hard to maintain. For example, there's a pregnant lady who wants to have her child. She's able to go to the hospital to have a delivery. But the moment the child is born, the doctors will refuse to register the child on the basis of the fact of no legal status of the parents and the child. So literally, you can be walking out of the hospital with the child in your hands, and you can be accused of having stolen the child because there's no legal proof that the child in your hands is your own. I mean, that's an extreme example, but it's not unreasonable to think that these are the kinds of problems facing irregular migrants across Southeast Asia. Access to basic healthcare, education of children, jobs, all of these become very, very hard to manage when you're in this legal limbo with no promise that it's ever going to be resolved. So with that in mind, these young activists decided that it would be useful, even if they couldn't get official recognition of the status of all these people, that they would create a database which would allow asylum seekers and other irregular migrants the chance of creating a space for themselves digitally, which would allow them to at least acknowledge in an informal, in a non-state sense, who they were and who they were connected to. So the idea of the purpose of this database is to enable each person, registered person, to be identified uniquely, to give them a digital identity that is secure and independent of state control. Of course, what that also means is once all the Rohingya in the diaspora are registered in this database, it becomes a census of undocumented Rohingya around the world and becomes an alternative locus for undocumented Rohingya to register their presence and to document their life transitions, albeit in an informal setting. What this virtual database ends up doing is mimicking the state institution of the official census, creating another foundation for the articulation of a distinct Rohingya identity. Now, there's an elaborate process by which these identities are made official, so to speak, are endorsed. The digital identity isn't something, again, you can just walk in and say, put me in this list and I'm going to be okay. There's a process of identification, authentication, and then authorization before the individual manages to get this, the private key that allows them to access this blockchain database. The identification examines the family and social relations of the individual, the knowledge that they have of the Rohingya landscape of Arakan, the social, linguistic, cultural, and other details that they are expected to know if they're legitimately a Rohingya person. Questions seek to uncover knowledge that are assumed to be uniquely accessible to the Rohingya people, including the language and the geographical particularities of the place that they've come from. Needless to say now, with so many Rohingya living in the diaspora, these questions about the homeland become increasingly fraught and difficult to answer. So they've worked exceptions into the rule, which if a child is born overseas with Rohingya parents, they would be automatically included. But if someone is applying to enter this from the diaspora, the rules sometimes can act as hindrances rather than ease the way of getting in because of their deep concern with not permitting false positives, not letting people who are trying to fake a Rohingya identity to enter the database. They're particularly thinking, in interviews we found out, that migrant workers from Nepal and Bangladesh living in Malaysia have sometimes claimed to be Rohingya in order to gain the support of the local people. Okay, so a set of conclusions before I go into the larger questions that I want to also raise for you based on this story. So Rohingya TV directly, as I've said, contests the state power, messages and meanings of what it means to be, of what the government is putting out. It shapes a counter narrative. And there's a high reputational cost for Myanmar when this alternative and credible news source essentially contests what they are saying is the condition of Rohingya on the ground. So this, of course, has legal implications down the line as well. If it ever comes to a point where some of these military officers and others who have carried out atrocities are ever brought to court, say the International Criminal Court, some of this data will actually end up being used as evidence by the jurists in order to see, in fact, whether the crimes that they are accused of have been actually committed. So this is valuable and important data, but I want to argue does not change the status quo appreciably. So it's absolutely critical to do and to keep doing and to have support in all sorts of ways. But we have to also recognize that given the weight of the respective players involved, it may not have a fundamental change in the condition of the Rohingya today. However, I want to suggest that the politics of recognition, the last three cases that I mentioned, rather than politics of confrontation, which is Rohingya TV, seeks to actually create a different kind of political landscape altogether by seeking international recognition through CONIFA, through Unicode, and through blockchain. It actually undermines state legitimacy by by actually ignoring, by bypassing the Myanmar government completely and saying, here we are creating identity for ourselves, yes, online, yes, virtual, but through these international actors, the support that we're getting actually makes a claim for our identity in the world in an entirely distinct and unique way. It sets up, I would argue, a parallel authority structure that takes on state functions and in a sense is far more disruptive and far more dangerous for the state because it essentially says we don't need you in order to do these different activities like having a census, like creating an identity for ourselves by registering our births, registering our deaths. We're going to do this anyway in a parallel system and others have recognized it for its legitimacy. We don't really care what you think. That said, the particular process by which they're going about this, which might make sense from a technological and from the variety of ways in which they put this together, has also problems and difficulties that I think we have to also recognize. In particular, I think the question of how a genuine Rohingya identity is established raises enormous questions in the way that they go about it. In effect, they are treating themselves as a normal, skeptical territorial state. They're mimicking exactly the process by which one gets identity established in the government. The burden of proof is always on those who are seeking admission, not the other way around. And often in this fear that there will be false positives, people who have been admitted without having the right to do so, the question of false negatives is also something that they haven't really confronted head on, namely legitimate Rohingyas who don't happen to fit the idea of what counts as Rohingya, who may not know everything that they need to know about memories of place and customs and so on, are being excluded from this database, even though they shouldn't be. The second aspect of the contradiction that I think is even more profound in some ways, because the first one in a sense can be solved, I think, with a little more thought and a little more care, is the long-term political ambition of these overseas Rohingya. I don't think there's been a lot of thought given to the long-term political objective of what this is trying to achieve, other than the restoration and return to the territorial homeland. Now, this is, of course, a project that seems increasingly more and more difficult to pull off, more and more difficult to establish. The government of Burma, if anything, has gotten more rigid and resistant to considering return. The question of what they will return to is something also that's extremely difficult to figure out, given the kinds of economic and other devastations that have taken place in that region. The tensions between the Rakhine population and the Rohingya people have increased in the years since the expulsions have began. And yet the imagination of what they seek, in a sense, is really no different from what you might have found in the early 20th century, when people from Poland or the Czech Republic and other places in Eastern Europe were seeking a country of their own. This is the kind of imagination that they had, that if only we could get a little piece of land with the borders and we could all go back there and live peacefully and happily. And in a sense, that project of the early 20th century of nationalism is now being transported to the early 21st century. And we have to really ask ourselves whether this possibility is something that we should be taking seriously. So even as this project is emerging from a diaspora, emerging in a virtual space, emerging using 21st century technologies, the political vision that they're ascribing to is one that I'm arguing is increasingly anachronistic or just out of time and out of place. They haven't been able to come up with an imagination which is perhaps more in line or more in tune with the technologies and the moment, the historical moment that we're in right now. Okay, let's take a deep breath. I'm going to have a glass of water. And let me switch now in the last few minutes that I have. Gegi, I'm doing okay for time. I'll take 5 more minutes, maybe. Okay. To talk about politics, STS, and Asia in a more, now stepping away from this particular case. So I want to suggest, as I've said in the beginning, that compared to sociology, compared to anthropology, compared to history in particular, the question of politics in STS has really not been as well developed or not advanced as far as it could be. Now, the initial impetus for creating a field of science and technology studies, I think, was deeply concerned about the question of technological modernity and the dystopias associated with it. we think immediately of Marx, of Veblen, of Mumford, as people in a sense who articulated that standpoint and who offered a vision, a deeply dystopic vision driven by technology, which range all the way from science fiction on the one hand to actually looking at the ways in which the Second World War and the Nazi regimes used technology in order to create a deeply dystopic and oppressive vision of the moment and of the future. Simultaneously, of course, with that, we've always had a kind of technophilia, which I associate today with the idea of Elon Musk, not the man, the idea of Elon Musk, which has always been about improving our conditions from household technologies, which have liberated women, to most recently vaccinations in a year's time to deal with the coronavirus condition, and all these other ways in which modern technology has extended, improved, and eased our lives, which no one, I think, would argue with, right? So we've had an old tradition, in a sense, which had dystopia on the one hand, which had liberation on the other, and we still have that. It's not going to go away, but it's not a very deep insight, shall we say, to say that here are the two poles of where technopolitics, in a sense, stands. In general, I would say when the questions of politics are on the table more concretely, we have two vectors. One goes from politics to technology, or the ways in which the politics of design and development, in a sense, and values shape the technologies that we have around us. Langdon Winner, of course, has to be mentioned here, as in his classic essay on Do Artifacts Have Technology? But going on very much to the present, when we think about all the work that's being done on AI and digital technologies, and the ways, for example, in which the biases of designers and coders have entered the system. I refer you, of course, to the recent scandal in Google, when the AI researcher from Ethiopia, the female researcher, gets expelled because she's making it obvious or making it very public, the kinds of limits that have entered the systems, the coding of these systems, as a result of the people who are actually putting them together. This is something that's very much an ongoing and important story. And I just want to point you in what I'm talking about here is really about the line, the direction of movement from politics to technology. Technology has become the repository, if you will, of a variety of politics which we don't always know. And so opening up that black box is, in a sense, one project of technopolitics or of this particular way of thinking. The second one, of course, is from technology to politics. And this is the standard story we hear whenever we hear, for example, about when India cracks down in Kashmir, the first thing they do is turn off the internet, right? So to manipulate the political field by using or misusing or extracting or eliminating technologies can also shape what we mean by politics fundamentally. Elections have changed as a result of politics. Elections have changed as a result of technology. The ways in which governments surveil individuals, their publics, has changed because of technology. So there we're talking about a route, in a sense, which goes from the technological to the political, shaping our political landscapes fundamentally, and in ways that, again, are critical and important and that we have to keep an eye out for and understand. But I want to go beyond a little bit these political binaries, because so much of the story that we're telling when we think about politics is the assumption of a liberal democracy at its heart. And this, you might say, goes back to the roots of a lot of these discussions in the United States, which took democracy, a liberal democracy, as a given, and wondered really only about the ways in which technology was limiting the performance and the outcomes and the practice of liberal democracy. And so what we then get in turn is a kind of response or a kind of politics which looks for amelioration. How can we prevent the excesses of technology from shaping these political fields in ways that actually that allow us to imagine the ideal of the liberal democracy in a way that isn't being allowed anymore? So what we get, in a sense, is that I would argue a kind of reformism built into this idea that, if only we could get the limits of technology marked a little more clearly, if only we could know the biases of technology a little bit better, we would actually end up in a situation where our democracy is better than it was before, or the constraints on it are removed and taken away. But I want to suggest that, that's still a very limited picture on which to paint. And so I want to argue, in a sense, that, look, we've got to start thinking about a political domain or the field of politics as not restricted only to liberal democracies, and not restricted only to direct confrontations, and not restricted only to demarcated territories. These are all markers of a particular kind of, if you will, 20th century politics circa 1993. the moment when the Cold War ends and, we're all happy and excited about the arrival of globalization, a lot of our political visions, in a sense, I would argue, stop at that point. And we're not actually thinking it through the variety of different kinds of political systems that we have, the illiberal democracies that are now so common around the world, the authoritarian systems that are equally present in various places, the non-confrontational politics that we see groups and organizations and movements engaging with, and the fact that now the field or the domain of politics is no longer on ground, as it were, on terrain, but also occupies online spaces and virtual spaces in ways that we couldn't have imagined 50 odd years ago. How do we incorporate all those conditions into our understandings of politics and suspend the assumption that democracy is always going to be the natural or inevitable outcome that we're trying to restore? So I'm, in a sense, at this point, being rather limited, I think, in my discussion by just saying, okay, the field we're looking at is too narrow. We've got to open up these doors. We've got to take into these other considerations, and then we'll be in a better place. Or, and this is the last slide I'm going to share with you, I want to suggest something a little more ambitious towards a global STS. And what does that mean? And I want to suggest that if we could imagine, if we could go through a thought experiment in which, rather than the liberal democracy, the United States, and places like that being our standards, being our norms, being the starting point from which we take off, what would STS look like if its starting point was the technosciences emergent from the informal sectors of global cities such as KL or Mumbai or Nairobi or Mexico City? I say that not just because I'm trying to celebrate Jugaad or one of these, these kind of informal assemblages that now have become popular, particularly in business schools and other places, but rather because the majority of the world lives in places like this. And I'm trying to say that, rather than start from a narrow, unrepresentative condition of the field of politics and the condition of technoscience, what happens if we begin from the global majority and work towards use that much, much wider, larger terrain on which to come up with a way of thinking about science and technology studies? I can say more about this in the Q&A, but I feel I've gone on too long and you've been very generous in listening to me. So let me stop at this point, and I'll be happy to pick this question or other questions up in the Q&A after Professor Usha has had a chance to speak. Thank you all, and I'm going to turn off my screen, share screen at this point.
Thank you, Itty, very much for this wonderful presentation. And I won't wrap the time. I just give the word to Usha to give her comments. I just want to remind the audience that you feel free to give your comments or questions. We have some coming in already, but you can also use the time before the question and answer to give your comments and questions. Thank you. So Usha, please.
Thank you, Gege, and thank you so much, Itty, for that talk. In fact, you preempted a lot of my comments because you went beyond the paper, but still, I hope I have something productive to say. So I just wanted to start off by, recognizing that this is an STS seminar. And as I was reading your paper, I was thinking that one of the generative aspects of STS really is the possibility of bringing into conversation multiple literatures and considering them in new ways of, and as you mentioned towards the end, of allowing the examination of context, action, actors, and tools in ways that their interplay becomes visible. So here we have in your paper something that takes on an ongoing political and humanitarian issue, a discrete set of responses by a core group of actors, the instruments used to facilitate those responses, and the meanings that emerge from their conjunction of community state network tools and their employment in the articulation of identity and voice. So what you've done is you've walked us through your paper, and what I'd like to do is to approach the paper and the questions it raises from the vantage point of my own familiar space, which is digital media studies, and push some of the questions you raise a little bit further while also teasing out some of the points that made me want to seek a bit more clarity. And perhaps this is something that we will come to in the Q&A session. And I'd like to consider them within the framework of other literatures that are perhaps not as explicitly referenced in this paper. So the way I read it, the central preoccupation of the paper is this: how do the Rohingya, as a dispersed people, retrieve their identity from the slew of devastating images that we have been served in the recent past? And how do they articulate a space that legitimizes this claim of a different identity or of an identity, and renders it not only visible in political terms, but recognizable in economic and social terms? So to do this, what the authors have done is to bring into focus 4 strategies or pathways to visibility: a YouTube channel, a sporting consortium, language and its script, and a blockchain-enabled digital identity. While 3 of these are creatures of the internet, the 4th, Conifa, while also arguably a creature of the networked world, gains much of its power through the spectacle of networked media. These 4 strategies, individually and in concert, give the Rohingya community, driven by its diaspora, the means to refashion, or one might say fashion, their presence on the world stage, while engaging with the politics of exclusion practiced by the Myanmar government. The authors make the very important point that even as the Rohingya use mechanisms that have become hallmarks of the 21st century, and I think this is something that Itty spoke about at some length towards the end, these digital spaces and tools. And just to quote from your paper, the complex of social, political, electronic, and virtual relations are situated against a 20th century political imaginary built around the homeland people language trinity. And this is an essential contradiction, right? And something I guess we will talk about more in the Q&A. And it is actually in this conundrum that my own interests find root. So when one thinks of the Rohingya, what comes to mind is the genocide and persecution of recent years, families fleeing through dense forests and muddy deltas that mark borders, only to find themselves hustled into camps for years on end, stateless and statusless. But this is not a recent exodus, right? And as you pointed out, the persecution and denial of identity and belonging has in fact created a significant Rohingya diaspora that has gained access to the tools that are now allowing them to engage on their own terms. And in your narration, this is driven largely by a small network of transnational players, individuals within media and academia, multilateral organizations, transnational entities, and technology gatekeepers. And I think the dynamic of these various actors and the tools they use is really worthy of closer examination, because what we get in the paper is sort of a broad overview. And I think the actual details of how these negotiations are working out, what sort of exchanges happen, let's say within the Unicode consortium, would be really interesting to look at how technopolitics play out. So in the article's narrative, the strategies used work primarily to articulate a politics of confrontation, as you said, and recognition. And the confrontation poses a counter to the discourse perpetuated by the Myanmar government and the Burmese state, and recognition in the international arena. So while 2 of these methods, that is the use of visual media, in this case YouTube, to gain an audience not only of peers, but of sympathetic global elites, and the use of sports to make a political point, are both familiar to media studies scholars. These have been used by other marginalized groups as well. And I think you made the point, for instance, Palestinians earlier, Kurds, Cypriots among them. And they've used these means to execute what you call a type of non-formal cultural diplomacy. And I became aware of this actually because Hyderabad has a fairly large Rohingya refugee population. And there's quite an active football community. And I think a couple of them actually even made it to the tryouts of the Rohingya football club. So that was an interesting part of the paper that I could identify with. So the other 2 strategies, other than Rohingya TV and football, are less familiar perhaps both to media scholars and I think to the popular imagination. And they pointed to an interesting nexus of technology-based advocacy that has important implications for cultural, political, and economic representation. So your description of the effort to digitize the Rohingya script, for instance, points to the sort of background work that must be done to create digital access to a community and make them participants in their own exercises of representation. By designing a script that aesthetically mimics Arabic, the community also positions itself within a global Islamic network. And this is something, of course, that you mentioned in the paper. But what that raised for me is, what does this do then to their positioning in the global conversation, right? I mean, as an Islamic, identifying themselves more with their Islamic affinities rather than with the homeland that they come from, or the putative homeland. So the Rohingya Vision TV website now has articles in the Hanifi script, an outcome of this particular effort. The other strategic initiative is to wrest control back from the state when it comes to digital identity. And the Rohingya project, which is behind the blockchain initiative, provides dispersed Rohingya with a digital identity that does not depend on the usual markers of geography or state controls. But then I think, again, you sort of preempted this question. What then does this do I mean, while it works in the online space, what are its implications in the offline, beyond, let's say, access to education and so on. So these last two strategies, that is the use of blockchain and the Unicode advocacy, are described quite a bit in your paper. I believe we really need to think through them a bit more as long-term political tools and consider what they achieve beyond the affective and the representational. There is no doubt that all the four approaches to gaining visibility mark significant representational gains and even serve as a means from which to mount a confrontational politics. But there remain problematic areas that require us to dig just a little bit deeper beyond celebrating them as worthy initiatives. So to begin with, the politics of confrontation as illustrated through the Rohingya Vision TV, on looking at the site, when you look at the site and the kinds of stories that are carried, you do point out in the paper that it seeks to build a counter narrative to state propaganda. But it also might be interesting to explore the reach and engagement of the audience. So even as Rohingya Vision TV might consciously build a unifying narrative for the Rohingya, it is in audience engagement that divisions and differences might emerge and a process of consensual identity building be constructed. And what I found interesting, and again, a point that you mentioned towards the end, is this particular quote from the piece, and I quote, "In a digitally drenched world, the implicit support of Facebook may matter more than the active support of some smaller members of the United Nations." But then what exactly is the role of this transnational public that is generated, let's say, by a network like Facebook, which is comprised both of Rohingya and others, in the larger project of bounding this community and giving it legitimacy in the actual spaces of the market or in global politics. So I think that is an essential conundrum that needs to be worked out. So broadly, those were my questions. And I think the issue of blockchain, which again, as you mentioned, reproduces some of the norms of the nation state while purporting to be on the outside and beyond the hostile state. How does, what are the issues that arise with the relatively small privileged Rohingya diaspora representing a large marginalized group that has little or no access to technology? And I think this is a question that's also being raised in the chat. And I think this also has to do with Unicode. And while Unicode, the successful advocacy with Unicode to legitimize the Rohingya script speaks to the politics of technoscience and how a combination of regulatory dynamics and technical language can yield productive questions. This, I think, also needs to be looked at beyond issues of representation, but also to issues of participation. So I was wondering if the paper and your work generally could bring into conversation, could come into conversation a little more with the literature in networked publics. What does politics mean in a post-state world? And where do questions of belonging, for instance, figure in this, which is of course an affective state, and perhaps the issue of Rohingya TV speaks to that in some sense. But what I found probably could add to the conversation is what is the impact of these initiatives, or maybe impact is the wrong word, but how do larger Rohingya communities make meaning of these initiatives within their lives as well? And other issues of marginalization, right? Issues of gender and other intra-community marginalizations. Where is the space for their inclusion within this discourse that emerges from a diaspora, an elite diaspora directed kind of discourse? So it was interesting to me that the figure of Muhammad Noor, who's a key actor across all 4 initiatives, really is so important, right? So what's the role of these people positioned within a particular transnational network? How does it direct these initiatives in specific ways? Because they are, they have access not only to the academic and cultural networks that are required to amplify these voices, but also perhaps the financial and the economic capital to do so as well. So yeah, those were broadly my comments. And I think just to return to the title, which you altered for this talk, my question is, or more of a comment, does the nation, the Rohingya nation, remain an imminent project? What might the politics and the possibilities of recognition outside the boundaries of the state look like? Thank you.
Thank you, Usha, very much for the beautiful comment and a lot of questions. And we also have questions from, should I say the floor or from YouTube? So Itty, can I ask you to try to respond to Usha in a very brief way? And then maybe we can pick up some of the questions also later also in response to other questions from the floor or from YouTube.
Sure, Gegi, thank you. Thank you, Usha, for the very, very thoughtful and far more lucid in some ways than my own presentation, I think, comment. You made it clear to me what I was trying to do, I think, while equally, I think, pointing out some of the limits or some of the further questions that emerge as a result of this particular way of seeing the problem. I haven't had a chance to look at the comments in the chat because I was listening to you, but we'll get to that later, right? Okay. So where should I begin? I think in terms of, you've raised a number of questions and we've made a number of really, really, I think, smart and interesting and important interventions. I'll just pick up on a couple of them then and try and say something. So let me start with the question of the idea of a Rohingya diasporic community. I think that one of the risks of writing in this particular way is that one gives the impression that this is a unified bloc. And I think that the first thing I want to make absolutely clear is that it isn't. One could argue that one of the underlying purposes of activities like the football club and like Rohingya TV is in fact to create unity among a very heterogeneous and diverse group of people, not just in terms of our usual categories of gender and age and so on, but also in terms of when they began to leave the country. So you've got the people who have remained in Burma and the ones who have left. Of the ones who have left, there are people who have been living from the early 70s onwards and all the way up to the present. And the length of time spent in the diaspora produces its own divergences from this idea of what it means to be Rohingya in critical ways that unfortunately I couldn't go into details here. And I will say that one of the issues that troubles, for example, established Rohingya diasporic communities in Thailand and Malaysia is the fact that older communities, in a sense, don't identify with being Rohingya in the same way because they left at different times under different conditions. And in particular, their children are ambivalent about what it means to be Rohingya. So, for example, young people who have grown up largely in Malaysia often distance themselves from a Rohingya identity because of issues of stigma or other concerns that, they could be discriminated against in some ways. They would rather be taken even to be Bangladeshi, which of course anathema to the larger politics of Rohingya, or to be taken as Indian, or just to be thought of as, Burmese without marker, in some ways. So those then become complications that I think are natural, given the sort of the life history of a diasporic community. It doesn't help the larger issue, but I'm just reinforcing your point that this is not a homogeneous community, but it is segregated and divided in all kinds of ways. I don't have to, I think, tell most of you who know something about the Rohingya, the question of gender and childhood is something that's very fraught. Young Rohingya girls are still being trafficked, sometimes by their own families, in order to have them married off at an early age. A number of activists working in Malaysia in particular on very much at the forefront of trying to help the situation. Inevitably, they come up against a kind of a rights-based approach and a community-based approach. The community being defined, of course, by older men, and the norms of community which have to be maintained, especially in the diaspora, coming up against what would be considered the rights of women and the rights of children anywhere in the world. Now, of course, it's not a problem that can be easily solved because, these are, in this day and age, in a sense, we've lost, I think, the ability to sort of uniformly say this is the answer to something like this for good reason. And so let's just put it again as another deep fault line that separates this community. From the point of view of media studies, I will make one more point in order, I think, to reinforce this idea of a divided community, which is that Rohingya TV is not the only TV station out there. So the Rohingya themselves have more than one television station with, I think it's not unfair to say, different agendas driving the politics of these communication media. This is the best, this is the biggest, this is the most established, this is the most well-funded. In that sense, it's the easiest one to go to and to do research on. But I think that a critical media studies approach would want to actually compare the different kinds of messages and the different kinds of formats being employed by these different television channels to see what their differences are, to see how they articulate difference, and to in a sense, get a sense of the internal politics of the Rohingya community that are being played out, I think, through these different media. I think that's something that is definitely a project that can be undertaken even long distance, because essentially you use the internet as your medium. The question of language, I want to remind us, of course, of the one classic case of where a new language actually inaugurates or becomes critical to a new nation, and I'm thinking of Hebrew. Now, the question of how Hebrew returned from being an ancient language to being a modern language, and its relationship to the rise of Israel and to a particular kind of Israeli politics today, I think is well known enough that we should, that even in conversations with some of the people behind this project, they were quite aware of that. And so they had very deliberately in mind this idea that uniformizing or standardizing the language in this way had advantages which are historically proven, as it were, in the example of Israel, but also in a sense would help to paper over or to help to diminish some of these differences that they're seeing today. So not all Rohingya see the script as their natural script. Some are more comfortable in Burmese, especially those who left earlier. Some have learned Bengali, how to write Bengali because of more recent departures, and they're living in Chittagong area for now a number of years. Others, of course, have been part of the Saudi diaspora for some time, and so they treat Arabic as a second language. And so I would say that this Hanifi script is also contested. It's by no means accepted as the norm, but once it's come online, once it has become the visualization of a Rohingya identity through script, its power has increased. So it has now become, if not hegemonic, at least the dominant way, that young Rohingya are being taught the language. And the question of being taught the language is critically important when you're growing up in camps, and we're growing up in a setting where other languages are in use at the same time, particularly Bangla, but also Thai and Bahasa Malaysia, depending on where they are at that particular time. So again, we should see this, I think, as work in progress. Here are some of the building blocks that are being put into place in order to create a unified Rohingya identity, which, although it's being claimed, is not yet very in place. And I think that the question of media in all its meanings, I think, are absolutely critical in the sense of seeing how that project develops and moves forward. Finally, the question of publics.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you? Sorry, can we come back to the question of publics a little bit later? Because there are two questions that I would like to share with you from the audience that actually talk to this very issue that you were talking about, the heterogeneity of is it okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
You can also see on the chat, but because I think it's kind of related to this discussion that you were just talking about. So one is from Devina Sarvatai, and the question is, how do we deal with the contradiction that stems from stable diaspora using technology to, in a way, enforce the very structure those still living in a precarity are trying to escape? That's one. And the other one, I think we can put these two together because it's all kind of related to this issue, is from Radhika. And Radhika's question is, you talk of the Rohingya here as a diaspora rather than as in exile. Is this how they see themselves as opposed to perhaps Tibetans? Yeah. Is the difference just semantic?
Yeah. No, those are great questions. Not addressing the question of public so much as the relationship between a homeland and a people in motion, shall we say, and a people outside. Now, I think that Devina's question, which is essentially how do we deal with the contradiction? I don't think we deal with it in the sense that we seek to resolve it. I think rather we recognize it as a contradiction and one that in a sense can't be resolved, I think, in an easy way. But the larger issue is like, how do we think about the relationship of those who are still in the homeland and those who are outside? I think there's simply no question that we realize that those who are living in the homeland, those who are living in the place that's always articulated and represented as the genuine homeland of the Rohingya people, are increasingly in the minority when it comes to expressing themselves or representing themselves or articulating a politics of any kind. It's the diaspora, in a sense, which is in a position to be much more vocal, which has access to other forms of address to the international community and to the Burmese government that allows them to be heard, and in a sense makes the diaspora itself more representative, if you will, of the idea of what it means to be Rohingya than the people living in Arakan or in the Rakhine state. And this is both a question of the limits that they're working under, the political conditions that they're living under, the lack of resources of those who are there. But at the same time, what the articulation of Rohingya identity from the outside is that that's our homeland. So they are privileged by being there, even as they are silenced by being there. So we have to just see them, those who are living within the Rakhine state today, as both privileged because of this representation, even as they're marginalized because of their material oppression under the conditions that they're in. We just have to see that as a simultaneous condition at the same time. Is this a diaspora or is this an exile? It's both. They are in exile, but they've also acquired the status of a diaspora because the exilic condition is now 3 generations old. As I was saying earlier, there are those who left in the 1970s all the way up to the present. So the ones who left in the 70s are not going back home. It's clear. They've had children in the overseas. The children, in a sense, have acquired the hybrid identities which are natural for people growing up in spaces outside, quote unquote, their homeland. And the conditions under which they live are closer to a diasporic community, with or without the amount of rights that you may have in different places, than simply a question of exile. So again, I'd rather not try and resolve these tensions, but rather hold them both at the same time. It's an exiled community as well as a diasporic community. It's a highly privileged homeland community which is deeply oppressed. I think we have to just remain within those binaries within recognizing those tensions as we talk about the Rohingya people. And I think it's a very hard thing to speak of for all these reasons, the Rohingya people as if they are a unified entity.
Thank you, Itty. I will just share one more question, and maybe then we can go back to other question from Usha if you think it's okay. Good. So we have a question from Depti Chatti, and the question sounds like this. Could you say more about what a reimagined virtual body politic in exile would look like in terms of its political power, particularly in the context where territorial politics are foreclosed, perhaps permanently? Could you say more about how you imagine such a virtual public would wield its parastatal power, besides exclude some people from being a part of it? I think this question kind of brings the conversation into probably a little bit broader spectrum, and maybe we'll have one more question that it will be even broader than this. But can you please answer to this one first?
Yeah, so I think this is a tricky question because I think our understanding of the notion or the question of diaspora or deterritorialized publics, national publics, to put it in a somewhat more broader sense, has changed significantly from the time when, let alone the beginnings of it, when we used to use the word diaspora to mean either African Americans in slavery who have moved to the Americas, or the Jewish or Armenian people who have been scattered and demobilized and spread all over the world. We've moved away from those particular framings of the word to really mean now anytime a community, in a sense, a national body finds itself divided across different spaces, the term used for those outside the homeland is diaspora. So it's in the second usage that I'm using these terms. The question of politics and the diaspora now become a little more tricky, right? Because ever since that notion of long-distance nationalism that Benedict Anderson put out some years ago in the 1990s, I believe, to talk about the ways that, for example, Punjabis living in Canada would have an influence on the politics of Khalistan in India today, or the ways in which other diasporic communities sought to affect conditions in the homeland, was still very much the idea that the politics of the homeland is what's going to shape the diaspora movement in some ways. In the sense that we were thinking, I think without realizing it, it was considered to be a transitional moment. It was a moment which was spatially separated, but which had an imagination of saying that in the future, it'll be possible for these communities to rejoin, to re-engage, to join up together again, and create, in a sense, to restore a national body that has been sundered, which has been divided in some way. I think today, we can't see it in those terms anymore. We have to recognize the simultaneity of an idea of a people linked to a place, however imaginary and fictional those linkages may be, and the people who see themselves as having moved away from that place, right? And I think that rather than saying the two are going to get resolved or the distinctions between this are going to break down, we have to see it in terms of the analog-digital divide. Just because there's a digital world out there doesn't mean that the analog space sort of disappears. In fact, it's at the interface of analog and digital that, in a sense, a new politics is emerging. So when we think, for example, about the ways in which governments might use social media in order to inflame people's sensibilities about a particular problem or to create enemies of the state, as they do in so many places, the effects of that, the material effects of that are not felt only online, but offline as well, when people are lynched or people are killed or people are hurt in various ways. So we are not in the position anymore of just saying only one area, only one space, only the other space is what matters. It's always about that intersection, that interface between these two different spaces, where, in a sense, where we see the politics playing itself out. The same thing is true, I think. This analogy of analog and digital has to be applied to the politics of exile and diaspora and homeland at the same time. Because it's that interface between those two and not the resolution of it that I think, in a sense, is producing the politics of the moment. I mean, when we see a condition where the diaspora is more representative of a national body than the national body back in the homeland itself, we're kind of left a little bit confused about where we should be looking, where we should be asking. The diaspora may reference that national community in the homeland as the original one, but actually all the stuff that matters is taking place outside. So again, I just think that, we cannot sort of sort this out in the sense of saying, this is the right one, this is the authentic one, this is the pure one. No, it's actually keep them both in play, or if there's more than two, keep them all in play at the same time. Look for those points of intersection between them. And that's the starting point to talk about where the political field may lie.
Thank you, Itty. Usha, do you have any comments on this? You want to jump in?
Yeah, so actually, I just wanted to relate what you're talking about to another question that's popped up on chat about, is it a case of a community trying to think like a nation through digital technologies? And I'm wondering how one thinks about that question in relation to historically dispossessed people, right? Like tribal communities or First Nations people. So is there then a kind of technopolitics that plays itself out in the online space that might provide a way to articulate these kinds of formations?
It's so on the one hand, yes, in a sense, what I'm pointing to is one of the primary contradictions of this story I'm telling is the fact of the imagination, the political imagination of these 21st century activists falling into a 20th century trap of nation, people, language, and happy ending after that, right? The kind of a teleology of politics naturally leading to the self-determination of a people in some way. I don't think we can sustain that idea anymore. I don't think that's, in this particular case, something that we can do anything more with other than to recognize the inadequacy of that particular vision for the particular time that they're in. I'm not saying it's easy to imagine what a 21st century politics of self-determination would be. I'm not using the word nation, but self-determination would be. But I think that for a community like this, it's an absolutely critical question to ask. And I don't know exactly what form it takes other than perhaps a negotiated settlement on the ground with the Burmese government, but also with the Rakhine people who also occupy that particular space in terms of some kind of spatialized autonomy, which is not by any means a happy situation, because you end up in a thing, I'm going to use a very strong word here, but you almost end up in a possible Bantustan kind of setting, drawing on the South African example, right? And I think that, that kind of spatial segregation makes it easy to imagine, a nation in the sense of a map and the other forms of or representations of nationhood that we've come to imagine, but it's not one in which I think most people would care to live in, because of the limits imposed on them and where they can go and not go. When it comes to the question of indigenous people, I think it's a different story altogether. There, I think that the claims to place are far more deep and meaningful than the idea of the nation itself. So I want to bracket off the nation as a particular kind of territorial imagination from the way in which the indigenous people can both lay claim to a place, but also in a sense identify with meanings and cultures and origins in a far more profound way than these kind of recently invented ideas of nation and all the rest of it, and so we're talking about an entirely different kind of spatial politics, it seems to me, in that case. And those of you based in Australia, those of you who think about the tribal situation in India, I think will recognize that, we can't conflate the claims to land or the quote unquote ownership of a particular place in the same way that a politics of Khalistan or a politics of the Rohingya and Arakan are articulated and represented. We have to keep these quite separate, because the nature of the relationship to the land is entirely different. So I want to, on the one hand, suggest that arguing for a politics of retaking a homeland in the way that the Rohingya want to do today doesn't make sense. On the other hand, I don't want to suggest that somehow forecloses the rights of indigenous people to their homelands, because I'm saying that these are different kinds of politics, different kinds of people, different kinds of histories, different kinds of meaning altogether.
Thank you, Itty. And let me, we are kind of 5 minutes behind, I think, but hopefully our audience will will stay with us in the extra 5 minutes, but I would like to bring this really interesting conversation back to STS through two concluding questions that we have from the audience. So one is from Suyatha Raman. The question goes like, could traditions of radical democracy, for example, as articulated by the World Social Forum, represent an alternative space of political imagination for STS? Itty, let me know if you cannot see it on the chat, but that's one question. And the other one is, that's kind of related to this in my opinion, but anyway, it's bringing it back to STS, is from Anushri Gupta. The question is, I want to know more about how a situated understanding of political fields can find a home within STS and the study of technopolitics in contemporary South Asia. Could you elaborate this a bit more?
Yeah, they're somewhat different questions. So Sujatha Raman's question is, I think, a very absolutely important one, but I'm somewhat unable to answer it because I think the question becomes one of goals and objectives. So a radical democracy is something that, to be honest, I think we need to say something more about before we know exactly what that means. I don't think that the World Social Forum is actually being, again, a unified space. And so different visions and different ideas about what futures ought to be, I think, need to be expressed a little bit more before we can work through that carefully. Let me just say that what I do take away from that question is the idea of political futures, or futures and politics being intimately joined. So I think that, in order to articulate what a politics would be, you have to begin by articulating what kind of future might be possible or desirable, and then begin the conversation to bring those two into conversation with each other. The Anushri Gupta's question about political fields in STS and technopolitics in contemporary South Asia. So I want to actually step back from South Asia or India, and I want to step back from Myanmar and so on in this larger conversation. I was hoping the idea of a global STS would be a sufficiently provocative that I would get get your own thoughts really on that. But we've kind of stuck very much, I think, within the frame of the talk, which normally I think is great, but in this case, I'd like to go a little bit beyond it. So I guess it's not so much a complaint that I've had or a criticism that I've had, but more like a sense of wonder of how we would be talking if the idea of an STS had emerged from different settings and different places. Now, if you look at the handbooks of STS that have come out over the last 30 odd years, increasingly we see a presence of non-Western places and people being represented as part of the picture of STS. I myself have been part of earlier conversations about a postcolonial technoscience and what that means. And if I can sort of offer a criticism of what that always meant, was that we were, in a sense, trying to expand the boundaries, the spatial, physical, and conceptual boundaries of STS to say, look, this has to include everybody in order to be representative of a field at this point in time. It was the idea of inclusion. It was very ameliorative, you might say, in terms of its larger impetus and project. What we didn't think through, I think, adequately was the conceptual underpinnings of what a global STS can be. What kinds of questions get asked about politics? What kinds of issues become normalized? And so, let me suggest one of the ways, for example, if we take my last question as the kind of provocation, what would a global STS look like if it came out of the informal sector of Mumbai? So
maybe in 2 minutes, okay? Two minutes.
Usha mentioned, for example, the idea of the assemblage, right? Bringing together a disparate, heterogeneous group of people and objects and ideas into a formation as the kind of way we think through in STS, which we do. Well, the one word that was missing from her description of that assemblage, which we would have to put in if we were thinking about the informal sector, is the word waste. So we would have to talk about people, we'd have to talk about machines, we'd have to talk about environment, but we would also include waste as one of the key resources that would be used in order to produce a technology when the informal sector is the starting point of your conversation. Big step, maybe? No, I'm not so sure. But I think quite critical in the sense of changing the meaning of that word waste from the end point or end product of a technological system to being the starting point or a mediating resource in the creation of new technologies. That's one. When we think, for example, of risk, again, a very commonplace in the idea, a commonplace term and a concept in our technoscience discussions, we would actually begin by asking, what is the relationship, or when we begin from precarity as the condition of everyday life, how do we understand risk? How do notions of risk get transformed fundamentally when precarity is the everyday condition of being? So suddenly our notions of the risk, threat involved in risk become, I think, far more reduced. We're less averse to risk because we're already under conditions of precarity, which make the possibility of disasters or catastrophes, which are inherent in the risk idea, seem a lot more normal or a lot less dangerous, a lot less terrible. Let me give one more example and then I'll stop. Contact zones, another term that's a very commonplace idea in our STS field. Contact zones now are imagined as the end point of interactions between unlikely subjects. So we start from somewhere else, we come together, and then we celebrate the contact zone as that meeting place of heterogeneity, of different places of people, of different machines, of different culture zones, whatever you want to have it, right? The contact zone would become the starting point, not the ending point, under STS and an STS system that begins from the informal sector. Because it's already hybrid. It's already heterogeneous. It's already always mixed up. The contact zone, in a sense, is the normal space to start from. There is no pure, uncontaminated place from which the contact zone acts as a counterpoint or as a kind of a distant other. It's the starting point. And then perhaps the search for something which is pure and uncontaminated becomes the question that we ask. So these are the kinds of reformulations that I'm thinking through when we think about what a global STS could mean. Leave aside the politics part. The politics part is like sometimes too hard to think through. But I just think, how would our everyday language and ways of thinking be changed if the informal sector of Mexico City was our norm rather than Lawrence Livermore Labs in Berkeley?
Thank you so much. It's really great to get to this more broad conversation on global STS at the end of the talk, and I wish we had more time to continue. But actually, we will have more seminars, and probably we will take the fruits of this conversation along with us there. So hopefully, both the audience who bared with us today, even be on time, and Usha and Itty, I hope that you will stay with us next time and will join us for the next seminars to continue this conversation. So thank you both of you, Usha and Itty, for the talk and the comments. Thank you all the questions from everyone in YouTube and for being here in this first ever TransAsiaSTS seminar. And thank you everyone for participating, and also thanks to everyone who supported us in technology and on YouTube and Twitter, and also to the Deakin Science and Society Network for hosting this event. So I think we had both TransAsia topics, and also at the end we have a good conversation on STS, global STS. So I think probably it's a good kickoff for this seminar. Kickoff, I say, because we will have other seminars this year, TransAsiaSTS seminars. So let me finish this with some announcements. So the next one will be in June 23rd. So it's always on Fridays. On June 23rd, we'll have Amita Bhaviskar from Ashoka University. And on September 24th, we'll have Aiwa Ong from UC Berkeley. And if you didn't have enough time to scribble it down, if you want to stay up to date on these informations from TransAsiaSTS, you can subscribe to the Google group. Laila and Emma will put you that link in the YouTube chat for you, and then you can find it and free to subscribe to the Google group and keep you updated with this information. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Usha and Itty, for the lively conversation. And see you all on June 23rd at our next seminar. Thank you.